Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, you all are having a wonderful day today. So, when it comes down to it, I thought that I would review this little video and talk about this little conversation that I thought was very particularly interesting. And for those of you that most recently watched my channel or watched a video that I most recently put out about that of Mr. Novak Djokovic, you know my argument about Mr. Novak Djokovic and what my opinion is about the big three. And of course, the big three being Mr. Roger Federer from Switzerland, Rafael Nadal from Spain, and of course, Novak Djokovic from that of Serbia. Of course, there's been a very long debate between the three of those fan bases and that of the tennis media about who is the true greatest of all time, who is the best or the greatest tennis player out of all three of them. Well, Novak Djokovic, in my view, once his peak level really hit his stride in that of 2011, I thought that it was very clear that Novak Djokovic became the more skilled and the more dominant player. And it wasn't just some sort of fad. It wasn't just some sort of 2-year period to where Novak Djokovic, he was very dominant, and then the rest of the time he kind of faded out, or at least, was not consistently the number one or beating some of those other guys like that, either of a Andy Murray or a Stan Wawrinka, who, by the way, were two other very great players throughout the early 2010s and mid-2010s. But they ended up fading a little bit more later on. Andy Murray, I believe, due to injuries, especially a hip injury. And Stan Wawrinka, I can't necessarily remember if he had any injuries or if he just kind of faded off by his own. But anyways, when it comes down to it, I thought that I would talk about this because for those of you that have heard my opinions about the argument in the past, Mr. Novak Djokovic, in my view, he clearly has set the tone for himself being the best and the greatest men's tennis player that I have personally ever seen. He's probably the greatest tennis player that I have personally ever seen. Certain people, of course, would disagree with that. I just don't think that there's a great amount of arguments anymore to really argue against it. When you talk about Mr. Novak Djokovic, he has the majority of the statistics, if not every single statistic. He has the majority of the Grand Slams, or the most amount of Grand Slams now, I believe, within that of men's tennis history, especially within that of the Open era. And it's very possible that Novak Djokovic, that he's probably going to win a few more, if not even a little bit more than that of a few more. Novak Djokovic right now is 36 years old, and I believe next year he's going to turn that of 37 years old. Roger Federer, of course, by the age of 37 or 38, I believe, he started declining a little bit as a player. So we'll see where Novak Djokovic goes from there. But it's very possible, who knows, that Novak Djokovic may even be able to give it a possible run for that of 30 Grand Slams. But in my personal view, for those of us that at least pay attention to that at tennis, we all know that more than likely that Novak Djokovic is winning that of the GOAT race or winning that of the greatest tennis player of all time race. The real question is about Novak Djokovic now, at least in my personal view, is that where does he fit in terms of the greatest athletes of all time list? Is he up there with certain guys like Michael Jordan? Is he up there with certain guys like Tom Brady or Joe Montana or Jerry Rice, who of course were great players for that of the NFL? Is he up there with Pele? Is he up there with Lionel Messi? Certain guys like that. Where does Novak Djokovic rank in terms of the all-time great athletes? And in my personal view, just my personal view of it, Novak Djokovic is in the same conversation with many of those athletes for a multitude of reasons. And we're going to talk about that in this video. But anyways, in this video, I believe this channel is called the Rich Eisen Show. They brought up a very decent amount of points that I thought would be very particularly interesting to talk about. And they're also going to bring up certain arguments of other sports as well that I also thought would be very interesting to talk about as well. So let's get into it. Let's see what they have to say.
They're very similar in not a lot of ways.
I think that's really interesting what you said about what the statistics say and how someone makes you feel. That's really interesting when you talk about greatest of all time debates, or we're debating top 5 or top 10s. You look at the NBA, the whole Jordan and LeBron thing. Statistically, LeBron James is the greatest player of all time. But for people of our era, we're all kind of the same age here. Michael Jordan made us feel a certain way because our eyes do not lie what we see on TV, right, TJ?
Well, here's my point overall about that conversation. And if you were going to compare the Michael Jordan and LeBron James debate versus the Novak Djokovic versus Roger Federer debate, it's not really along the same lines. It's not really the same type of comparison. And the reason why that is first of all, because tennis is an individual sport, at least when you're mainly competing for that of individual Grand Slams, while that of basketball is a team sport. Many people, of course, put LeBron James over that of Michael Jordan because he has the rebounds and the assists and certain other stuff like that over Michael Jordan. But what people don't understand about basketball is not only that it's a team game, but when it comes down to it, when you're in a team game and when you have a certain type of system and a certain type of coach like that of a Phil Jackson playing in that of the triangle system, Michael Jordan was never going to average as many assists or rebounds as that of LeBron James because LeBron James plays in a completely different system. When you're playing in an individual sport like that of a tennis, the statistics can be compared more in a vacuum or individually because a lot of them are competing and I'm not going to say playing in the exact same ways, but they're doing a lot of the same things. In basketball and football, you can't necessarily compare the statistics, always side by side because of the different eras, and on top of that, the way that they play. Michael Jordan, by the time that he was winning NBA championships, he was no longer playing in that ball-dominant system where the ball and overall the main system always ran through him. Now, was he the main scorer? Was he the main weapon? Yes, of course he was. But there's a reason why Michael Jordan, a lot of the times, he would not always lead in certain assists or rebounds because they knew that they had to get others involved. A big part of the reason why LeBron James is 4-6 in the NBA Finals is because he has been way too ball dominant in his career. And whether people want to admit that or not, that's a big part of the reason why he is 4-6 in the NBA Finals. And certain LeBron James fans and certain media members, they'll tell you, oh, that's not true. It's just that LeBron James faced way more talent. He never had a chance to win 6 championships. That's not true at all. All the way back in 2014, the San Antonio Spurs were an older team. Now, they were still very disciplined. They were still thoroughly coached by that of Greg Popovich. But Tim Duncan, I believe, was 37 years old at that point. Tony Parker and Manu Ginobili, neither of them were all-stars that year, I believe. Maybe Tony Parker was. I can't remember. I think there was one all-star for the San Antonio Spurs team that year. They had one all-star, either Manu Ginobili or Tony Parker, I believe, and they were able to pretty much wax LeBron James in that series 4-1 because LeBron James, the way that he plays so ball dominant and it affects his team negatively. LeBron is always going to be a guy that, he affects the team positively and negatively at the same time because he's going to make your team better as an individual talent. But in terms of actually making the players better around him, he's not going to do that because when you play in that ball dominant system, that doesn't really make anyone better. That's why certain players, whenever they play with LeBron James, even if they're greatly talented, that's why LeBron James fans and the media, they always complain about LeBron James never having any help. But when Michael Jordan played with basically one all-star throughout the whole entire 90s with just Scottie Pippen, he was able to go undefeated in the NBA Finals. That's because Michael Jordan played in an actual system and they played a much smarter style of basketball where it was much more of an equal opportunity offense. And when you have an equal opportunity offense, the system is not built around you getting a triple-double every single game. The pace is also much higher today. It's not as much, of a defensive era. Back then, in the 90s, a game could have potentially ended with the game maybe being anywhere from the 80s to 90s. Today, basketball games usually will end in that of the 110s to 120s, if not sometimes even a little bit higher. So once again, the 90s era, not only was it a completely different era, but Michael Jordan and LeBron James play in a completely different system. On top of that, Michael Jordan beats him in MVPs, Finals MVPs, championships, and overall, he was just a better all-around basketball player. When you talk about Roger Federer and Novak Djokovic, not only are they both in an individual sport, but they were basically in the same era. Now, by the time that Novak Djokovic was starting to reach his peak, yes, that was in 2011 where Roger Federer, he started turning 30 to 31 years old. But Roger Federer was not in the Pete Sampras. He was not in the Bjorn Borg era. He was not in the John McEnroe or Ivan Lendl era. He was not in any of those eras. Serena Williams, Roger Federer, Novak Djokovic, and Rafael Nadal, they all played in the longevity era to where basically you could be competitive for Grand Slams until around you hit that 37 to 38 year range. All right, that's the era that he played in. So, this narrative of, oh, well, Roger Federer, he makes us feel a certain way. but Novak has the statistical advantage. Once again, if you're going to compare it to the LeBron James and Michael Jordan conversation, it's not really the same conversation because LeBron James basically plays in a way to where he knows he's going to get those stats in the first place. But, a lot of the times it's not conducive to winning the most amount of championships. Novak Djokovic, the difference between him is that not only is he having the advantage in the majority of the statistics, but the style that he plays and how a complete player that he is, it's very conducive to winning, and it's gotten to the point to where not only is he leading in every statistical advantage, but he is now winning in the Grand Slam race.
And so, you're debating all this stuff like Tom Brady is the greatest of all time statistically. He does make me feel a certain way because I'm a New England fan, but your eyes might tell you that Aaron Rodgers was a better quarterback, played the position better, or Patrick Mahomes is on his way to playing.
Aaron Rodgers, once again, the most overrated quarterback to ever play the NFL game. And don't get me wrong, all-time great quarterback, but the way that Aaron Rodgers was so praised throughout his era, there were so many media members that would always say that Aaron Rodgers was better than Tom Brady. It would just depend on the system and that, he didn't have the talent around him. And don't get me wrong, Bill Belichick is an all-time great coach. But even when Tom Brady had Bruce Arians as his head coach, a guy that I believe had never won a championship as a head coach before, Tom Brady, of course, they had a great amount of talent in Tampa Bay. He was able to win with them there. Point is this about Aaron Rodgers. Aaron Rodgers really, when we talk about the talent level that he truly was, Aaron Rodgers should have won about 3 more NFL championships or 3 more Super Bowls than what he actually did. He blew it all the way back in 2014 against the Seattle Seahawks. He blew it, I believe, his last year in the playoffs against the 49ers. And he blew it in that NFC Championship against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. So Aaron Rodgers, even for the great quarterback that he is, when you really take a look at his statistics, because so many people take a look at his touchdown to interception ratio, which is great, don't get me wrong, he did revolutionize the game, and I do believe that Aaron Rodgers is a top 10 quarterback of all time. When you really take a look at his touchdown to interception ratio and that of NFC championships, it goes from like 5-1 in other games, and when it comes to NFC championships, I believe it's almost about an even amount of touchdowns and even amount of interceptions, which shows you that Aaron Rodgers, even with certain great talent around him, he just doesn't do well under pressure.
The position better, and maybe he might be the greatest of all time. It's a very interesting way of looking at it that I never.
And Patrick Mahomes, in my view, if he keeps going the way that he's going, just like I had predicted, he is going to be greater than Aaron Rodgers. In my view, he basically already is ahead of Aaron Rodgers, but he does have to do more work.
Never thought before, so thank you for bringing that up. And I think tennis-wise, yes, Roger Federer made us all feel a certain way. I think for maybe our generation, Pete Sampras made us feel a certain way, and we thought he was the greatest we'd ever seen, yet he never won the French Open. And statistically, Djokovic is the greatest of all time, but he makes people feel a certain way, sometimes in the negative, because of how he acts, his demeanor, his whole anti-vaccine stance, whatever side you feel about that. Can make you feel a certain way.
Right, but what has Novak Djokovic really done to make the tennis media and the tennis fans really hate him that badly? It's very obvious that the tennis media, for whatever reason, they don't like Djokovic. For whatever reason, it could be mainly because they like Rafael Nadal and Roger Federer. Just like that of ESPN, they adore LeBron James, so any main threat that is going to come against him, they don't like, whether it be Steph Curry or Kevin Durant or yada yada yada. And a big part of the reason why they don't like some of those players versus LeBron James is because LeBron James not only is more marketable, but when you're more marketable, they also can use you more of a pawn to basically promote their theories and to promote, their misguidances, which basically they've used LeBron James for a very long time to pretty much, appoint their bullshit liberal ideologies. Same with that of some Rafael Nadal and Roger Federer stuff. When it comes down to it, I think a big part of the reason why the media does not like Novak Djokovic, and don't get me wrong, that's not me saying that, maybe he's not bought off a little bit by other consultants, who knows, but at least by that of the Nike machine and other companies like that, he's not the same on the super duper liberal hype train. He did not want to get the vaccine, a vaccine that never really once again showed any super duper effectiveness in the first place when it came down to it, and a illness with COVID-19 that was already around about a couple years prior, and then all of a sudden they suspend Novak Djokovic out of nowhere in the 2022 Australian Open. That's why I say, and it's no offense against Rafael Nadal, all-time great player, I don't count that 2022 Australian Open. That would basically be like in another particular sport when it comes down to it. That would basically be like banning Tom Brady, from the NFL playoffs when he saw the prime of his career and when he just won the Super Bowl, and then calling yourself, the true winner. Like, I'm sorry, I just can't do that. Or say against UFC, that's like banning John Jones overall because of, the vaccine stance, and then Daniel Cormier ends up winning the belt, and then he's allegedly the number one guy. Like, no, I'm sorry, I just can't do that. Novak Djokovic, a guy who has repeatedly won the Australian Open, the most amount of Australian Open titles within, tennis history, I believe. They banned him over a vaccine stance. No, I'm sorry. I do not count that Australian Open title in 2022, just me personally.
And it's a very interesting way of looking at it.
Yeah, because, at the end of the day, not everybody has the same opinion. And there's a reason for that. Because statistically, there is no more argument. He has now surpassed both Roger Federer, Rafa Nadal statistically in virtually every category. You can't deny it. Stats don't lie.
Well, Djokovic pretty much has surpassed him in every single category. It's not really even just statistics. When you talk about all-around conditioning, it probably is Novak Djokovic. When you talk about all-around skill, it is Novak Djokovic. When you talk about who is the best under the bright lights and under pressure, in those clutch moments, it is Novak Djokovic. When you talk about the head-to-head record, it's Novak Djokovic. There's at number 1, Novak Djokovic. ATP Finals, Novak Djokovic is tied with that of Roger Federer. And when you want to talk about who's the most complete player on all surfaces, it pretty much is that of Novak Djokovic. So there's just really no categories that they beat Novak Djokovic in. That's why I say I just don't really see an argument for that of Roger Federer, no Nadal. There's just really nothing that either of them beat him in.
So he is the GOAT statistically. But that legacy, that emotional, subjective quality is not always going to be that case. And there are millions of people, believe me, when I tweet out that Novak Djokovic, and I believe he's the greatest athlete on the planet right now. The greatest athlete on the planet right now. Bar none, in my opinion.
And let me tell you what, you could have a serious debate that Novak Djokovic is the best athlete on the planet right now, or at least is the greatest. And when I say greatest, I mean greatest athlete that is currently active. Because when we talk about any other particular sport at the current moment in time, who really is on the same level as a Novak Djokovic right now in terms of what he's been able to accomplish and still the level that he's still at? Novak Djokovic, when we really talk about what he's doing, it truly is special because of a couple of reasons. Not only is he still winning Grand Slams, but at 36 years old, he's still competing for the number 1 spot. Rafael Nadal hasn't had the number 1 spot, I believe, for about several years. And Roger Federer, I don't know, when he was active, I don't even remember the last time that he had the number 1 spot. He may have not even had the number 1 spot ever again once Djokovic took over in 2011, but I can't remember. If I'm wrong on that, one of you guys can correct me. But anyways, Djokovic not only once again is competing and winning the majority of the Grand Slams, but he still is competing for the number 1 spot. What makes it so impressive is that he was competing for the number 1 spot the majority of the time and the majority of the titles in Grand Slams throughout the 2010s when both Nadal and Federer, they were at the peak of their powers and Djokovic was fighting back against them. But then on top of that, he's still, even at 36 years old, is still competing for the number 1 spot. That would basically be like an NBA player, kind of like Michael Jordan, not just winning the NBA trophy, but also winning MVPs still at 36 or 37 years old. So that's what makes what Djokovic is doing right now very thoroughly impressive.
The individual aspect of the sport, what he's doing at his age, the physicality, and then you factor in the mental strength that he has as well, there's nobody that touches him, in my opinion, right now.
I would somewhat agree with that. Novak Djokovic has a very great debate about who is the greatest athlete right now, or who is the best athlete all around on earth with the most amount of accomplishments. once again, certain people might disagree. I just don't see another athlete, in my personal view, that'd be ahead of him right now. I mean, there are some great athletes in every single particular sport. Maybe certain people would debate Steph Curry or LeBron James for that of the NBA, but I'm not quite sure if I would do that because Novak Djokovic is probably the greatest tennis player that I've ever seen, just in terms of his skill set and his accomplishments. The NFL, they pretty much have completely changed over their era. Tom Brady has retired. Peyton Manning is no longer there. And there's a certain amount of other guys that are not there. Patrick Mahomes, of course, he's done some great things. But once again, Novak Djokovic, he's just doing it on another level. And when I think about any other particular sport at the moment, I just don't see any other athlete right now that could probably be a greater athlete than him. Maybe Lionel Messi in terms of his accomplishments, maybe Messi, but he's clearly on the decline, at least from what it looks like, even though, of course, he just won the 2022 World Cup. But, we'll see what ends up happening with that. But anyways, right now, Novak Djokovic, in my view, I also would probably place him number one. Now, of course, certain people, they don't take tennis quite as seriously as what they do other sports. But tennis is a sport that not only requires a great amount of athleticism, it requires a great amount of flexibility, a great amount of conditioning, great speed, and also great strength as well to hit back the shots and to get your certain positioning out there on the court. Great conditioning within multiple weather conditions. But on top of that, it requires a great amount of nuance within your game, a great amount of completeness, a multitude of skill sets, potentially, a certain amount more than a lot of other sports out there. And on top of that, you have to face a multitude of conditions, probably more than any other professional sport out there. Because not only do you have hard courts, but you have clay courts and you have grass courts. You have indoor hard courts and you have a couple of other ones, or certain hard courts that may be slower, certain ones that may be faster. So the conditions, they could always potentially be different. That also is, a big factor of what Novak Djokovic is doing, of what makes it so great. Because a lot of people truly don't understand how complete of an athlete and how complete of a player you have to be to really get to that level. Because once again, you have to be complete on clay, you have to be complete on grass, complete on hard court. You have to be very intelligent. You have to have great anticipation of where the ball is going to go. You have to have great defense and great offense for tennis. On top of that, you have to have great conditioning. You have to have great mental fortitude, just like Novak Djokovic has done. You have to have great flexibility. And once again, great conditioning. So like I said, Novak Djokovic, a lot of people, they don't look at tennis as a sport that requires the most amount of athleticism, but it requires a lot more athleticism than one would think, and certainly a lot more IQ than what one would think. Once again, it takes a lot to be as complete as what Novak Djokovic is for his particular sport.
Greatest athlete on the planet.
Yeah, you were looking at that final, the championship match. The first set, I think, took, an hour and 20 minutes? And you're like, wow, if this thing goes 5. They're going to be playing for 6.5 hours. I couldn't imagine doing anything that long, let alone something as grueling as one-on-one individual tennis at the highest of highest levels. And I think you're right. I mean, that's a good debate.
Well, if we're just going to talk about how they made you feel, then I'm sorry, he's never given me the feeling that Andre Agassi did. Because for my era, like, that guy, when I was much younger, it was Boris Becker. Because I can remember going, wait a minute, this dude's like 17 and he's winning Wimbledon? And then Agassi came along with all the flash and the headbands and the colorful, tennis attire and the sneakers. And you couldn't tell me Agassi wasn't the greatest. And it kind of made me dislike Pete Sampras a little bit, because that was a hurdle that Andre didn't seem like he could get over. And even though Pete, I think most people would agree, was the better player, I always held it against Pete because it was like he was impeding Andre's progress for him to be the greatest. So, yeah, the how they make you feel argument does get brought in a lot. People get caught up in their feelings, right? When it comes to discussing
all the feels,
who's the best and who you like the most.
And I'm with you. I'm an Agassi guy. So I grew up, it was Pete and Andre. And to me, I resonated with Andre. Everything that he did on and off the court, I thought was so cool. So Agassi to me is my favorite tennis player of all time. That doesn't make him the greatest tennis player of all time. Because when you have...
No, Andre Agassi is not the greatest tennis player of all time. And he was a great tennis player, but Andre Agassi, I'm not really even quite sure if he would make my top 5. Probably would not. Because you would have Novak Djokovic, Roger Federer, Rafael Nadal. Now, if, you were maybe going to debate that Nadal and Federer, that they were in a completely different era, so maybe it could have been different back then. Who knows? If you wanted to debate that, I would understand. But even if we're talking about other guys, he would not be over Pete Sampras. He also would not be over that of, what's his name? Bjorn Borg, I believe the Swede. And there might even be a couple of others that he may not be above either. I would have to also remember how many Grand Slams Ivan Lendl won. I thought he either won 6 or 8, but I might be mixing that up with Boris Becker. I can't remember.
8 majors, and then you have, even with Pete, 14, right? But now 23. It's tough to argue with those numbers. That said, he's still my favorite.
Yeah.
The minute that he followed me on Twitter and Instagram, those were moments in my life. and I still check to this day. Like, I'll be like, let's see if Andre's, because he doesn't follow a lot of people, right?
That's
so
funny.
I'm like, does he still follow me? Oh, he does. All right.
The idea of like your heroes now knowing who you are is just the craziest thing ever.
So
Especially
cool.
for us in this world now. Like, oh, so-and-so, they recognize me. That's incredible. I had your poster on my wall when I was a kid.
Yeah, that is saying
100%.
something, man, because even though I'm not 100% sure that they would remember my name, I know for a fact that if I went somewhere and I saw Deion Sanders or Michael Irvin or Troy Aikman or Stone Cold Steve Austin, they might not be like, hey, TJ, but they'd be like, yeah,
that guy,
I know you.
I
That kind of makes you go, oh, man, like, I can't believe
It's
this,
wild.
you know?
It's wild.
It's awesome.
Catch the Rich Eisen.
But anyways, that's pretty much about it for this video. I just thought that I would talk about that because many people, when it comes to that of the tennis conversation, other than that of Serena Williams, many people, Serena Williams or Roger Federer, many people don't usually have debates about tennis players debatably being the greatest athlete on the planet Earth, or at least being the best all-around athlete on planet Earth. And when I talk about best all-around athlete, of course, I'm not just talking about who can jump the highest or who has the most powerful punch or, who is the biggest built. I'm talking about who is the greatest for their professional sport. And when you talk about who is debatably the best all-around athlete on the planet Earth, you could debate right now that it is Novak Djokovic. He is still competing for that #1 spot repeatedly. And on top of that, he is still winning Grand Slam titles. Let me also state this just to kind of cap the video off, because many of the comments that I always see from that, especially of the Roger Federer and Rafael Nadal fans, but especially the Roger Federer fans, and don't get me wrong, he was a great player, but one of the comments I always hear from those fan bases is that Novak Djokovic is now winning slams in the weakest era, which really is bullshit. And don't get me wrong, a lot of the younger players, they are having a little bit of problems trying to capture Grand Slams, like that of Stefanos Tsitsipas or Alexander Zverev, or that of, Dominic Thiem, he pretty much just fell off the edge of the earth, but other players, that maybe I'm not thinking of at the moment, even Daniel Medvedev, some of the other guys, all that is understandable. But I never got this because the Roger Federer fans, for whatever reason, they always try to argue that Novak Djokovic's era is the weakest era. Really, the weakest era that I personally ever seen in tennis history was probably that of the Roger Federer era, between that era of the 2000 to 2009 era. I mean, Andre Agassi and Pete Sampras, I believe that they were still competing for Grand Slams, at the early part of the 2000s. But I'm pretty sure by around 2003 that both of those players, they were pretty much faded out. At least Andre Agassi was. For Pete Sampras, I can't necessarily remember. But when you talk about other players during that era competing with Roger Federer, like other than Rafael Nadal, like who really was there? Like people always say that, Roger Federer, he was facing better competition than Novak Djokovic, or his peak was higher. It's like, dude, who really was he facing? Like Roger Federer, what he almost reminds me of is the Shaquille O'Neal of tennis, to where he was very dominant, debatably the most dominant, but during an era to where really almost no one else was around. Like Shaquille O'Neal during the early 2000s, like he was very dominant and he was beating the San Antonio Spurs. But when you take a look at those finals teams that they defeated, It's like, who really did they ever beat? Like, they beat a Jason Kidd-led Nets team that really had no one else on there. They also beat the Indiana Pacers that had, Reggie Miller, and the rest of the team I don't really even remember. And then they also beat the Allen Iverson-led 76ers, and that pretty much was the only player that they ever had on there. When you remember the Roger Federer era during that of the 2000s, it's like whoever was really there to challenge him besides that of Rafael Nadal. It's like Andy Roddick or, some other these players. Like, come on. Who we trying to fool here? Like, you can't name any other great players throughout that generation. Throughout the 2010s, I can name you several. Once again, not just Djokovic, not just Federer and Nadal. You had Andy Murray, you had Stan Wawrinka, and you had a couple of other very decent players as well. Martin Del Potro, I believe. You also had a couple of other decent ones. I'm trying to remember who else was there in that era. I believe, Cilic, I believe, that one player from that of Croatia, if I'm thinking right, that won the Wimbledon, those several years ago. But anyways, that's pretty much about it for today. Just thought that I would talk about that. But I thought that this was a very interesting conversation because I would have to agree with the gentleman here that Novak Djokovic would very much debatably, in my view, also be the best athlete on the planet right now, or at least the greatest at the current moment. So anyways, that's pretty much about it for today. Thank you so much for watching. I'll talk to you all later.